Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be learning with you as part of Falsman at Drisha. Welcome to the 7th session of Mishnah in Depth, Bava Metzia with Dr. Rachel Furst. The Mishnah in Depth series is a project of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. This class is a supplement to people studying Mishnah Yomit independently, covering and we are assuming that you are covering 1 to 2 mishnayot on each day on your own, following the schedule, and we will come together once a week for a class, for a BEU and shiur, where we will dive in a bit more detail in the past week's material. We've had the pleasure of learning for these past few weeks with Dr. Furst. It is always a pleasure to have her back at Drisha. She is a scholar of Jewish law and Jewish history with a focus on Jewish-Christian relations in medieval Europe, as well as women and gender. She has taught in Israel, the United States, and Sweden. It's been a pleasure learning with her these past few weeks. And I'm going to pass things over to Dr. Furst.
Great, thank you very much for that. And thanks to everyone who is joining us or rejoining us this week. So those of you who are learning with the Mishnah Yomit schedule, today should be finishing up chapter 8 and beginning your study of chapter 9 of Tractate Bava Metzia. So today's class is going to focus on chapter 8. And I'm going to share my screen with you. So the topic of the primary, I should say, the opening topic and the primary topic of chapter 8 is in fact laws that pertain to a shoel, or a borrower. As we will see, there are other topics that this chapter discusses, but that is the opening one, and this chapter is in fact known as Perek HaShoel, or the chapter that pertains to the borrower. When we talk about the borrower, we're referring to one of what is known in rabbinic parlance as the 4 shomrim, or the 4 different types of guardians who assume a certain measure of responsibility for someone else's property. We began to discuss these 4 shomrim, or to learn about these 4 different types of guardians of others' property back in chapter 3, known as Perek HaMafkid, the chapter of one who deposits an item with another individual. And our chapter continues that discussion. Last week, when you studied chapter 7 of Mishnah Bava Metzia, you will have encountered a Mishnah that we're going to take a look at together in just a few moments that spells out the different names and the different levels of responsibility of these guardians. But before we delve into the mishnayot of chapter 8, I'd like to begin by taking a look at the Torah verses from where these the laws pertaining to these different types of guardians are derived. We've discussed several times over the course of the past several weeks that the laws of Tractate Bava Metzia are, for the most part, fairly well grounded in the Torah itself, in biblical verses. That's one of the features of rabbinic civil law at large, and in particular, the subjects that are covered in Tractate Bava Metzia. So the verses that we are going to take a look at, the verses that are relevant to our study of these 4 shomrim, and in particular to our study of the borrower, which is the focus of our chapter today, derive from Shmot Kafbet, or from Exodus chapter 22. You'll see there's a whole series of verses here. The first several of them, from verse number 6 through verse number 12, pertain to the first 2 types of guardians, And that is, again, we'll see in just a moment in the Mishnah, what the rabbis label shomer chinam, or the one who guards property of another person's for free, without receiving compensation, and the shomer sachar, one who guards another's property with compensation. Now, those terms do not appear explicitly in the Torah, and in fact, these first several verses don't neatly break down into those two different categories. Nevertheless, the rabbis understand that all of these opening verses do in fact pertain to those two different types of shomrim. And I just want to take a look briefly at some of these verses. Right? Ki iten ish el re'ehu kesef o kelim lishmor. When a party gives money or goods to another for safekeeping and they are stolen. I'm sorry, lishmor, for safekeeping, v'gunav mi beit ha'ish, and they are stolen from that other party's house. Im yimatzeh haganav yishalem shnayim, if caught, the thief shall pay double. However, im lo yimatzeh haganav, v'nikrav ba'al habayit el ha'elohim, im lo shalach yado b'milechet re'ehu. But if the thief is not caught, then the owner of the house, and the owner of the house is in fact not the original, the actual owner of the stolen property, but rather the guardian, the one who has assumed responsibility for this property, right? That owner of the house shall depose before God and deny laying hands on the other's property, right? So that person has to take an oath, according to rabbinic law, that he has not, or she has not, in fact, laid hands on the property. They have not misappropriated the property. They have not been negligent with the other person's property. And the verses go on to talk about what exactly the rules are. Now, we're not going to focus on all of those rules right now, because our primary interest today is, in fact, in the final two verses of this Torah section, and that is verses number 13 and 14. So let's read those two together for just a moment. V'chi yish'al ish me'im re'ehu, v'nishbar omet, right? So if a party, in this case, borrows something, but let's assume, because in the previous cases, in the previous instances, we were talking about animals, let's assume that that party borrows an animal from another person, and that animal dies or is injured, nishbar omet, be'alav en imo shalem yeshalem. Its owner not being with it, restitution must be made. And we're going to pay careful attention to each one of these phrases. We're going to take a look at that carefully in just a few moments. But the Torah goes on to say, Im be'alav imo lo yishalem. If its owner, however, was with it, then no restitution need be made. Im sachirhu babischaro. But if it was hired, that payment is due. And again, I want to point out the translation that we're using here is the translation of the Jewish Publication Society of JPS. I took this particular translation from Sfaria, the Sfaria website. As we all know, any translation is by definition also an interpretation. And so the way that JPS renders that verse, im be'alav imo lo yishalem, im sachirhu babischaro, if its owner was with it, no restitution need be made. But if it was hired, that payment is due. We're going to see that that's not the only way to understand these verses. But again, here I want to point out, this is a continuation. These two verses are a continuation of the previous ones. Even though in these two verses, we're not talking about somebody who was asked by the owner of the items to watch over them, whether for free or with compensation. Here, the one who initiated the guardianship, if you'll call it that, is in fact the one who received the object, right? It's the borrower or the hirer, right? The renter, let's say, of this particular animal or other piece of property. That person was presumably the one who initiated the relationship. But even so, what we effectively have here in these two cases is a situation in which an individual who is not actually the owner of the property nonetheless finds him or herself in a situation where that property is entrusted to their care. They are the ones who are currently in possession of the, again, animal or other object, and they are the ones who thereby assume responsibility for it. Now, just to make this a tad clearer, I want to take a look, as I said, at that Mishnah from chapter 7 that you studied last week, which spells out the different categories of shomrim or guardians that the rabbis understood those verses that we just read to be talking about. The Mishnah says, Arba'a shomrin hen. There are 4 different types of belis, or again, belis is another way of saying guardians, to whom different halachot apply. They are as follows, right? I'm back in the Hebrew. Shomer chinam, v'hashoel, noseh sachar, v'hasocher. It's interesting, pay attention to the order that the Mishnah here in chapter 7 introduces them. The Mishnah says, first of all, there is an unpaid beli or guardian who receives no compensation for safeguarding the item. And then there is the shoel, the borrower of an item for his own use. On the flip side, there is a shomer sachar, or a paid beli or guardian, who is provided with a salary or some form of compensation for watching over the item, and a renter that is a beli or guardian who pays a fee for the use of a vessel or animal. Now, I just want to pause here for a moment and ask, or perhaps throw out the question, why might the Mishnah have presented the 4 categories of shomrim in this particular order, or in this particular grouping, I would say? In other words, the Mishnah seems to be listing the shomer sachar, the unpaid beli, together with the shoel, the person who borrowed the item, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the shomer sachar, or paid beli, together with the socher, or renter. What might be the logic for grouping these 2 different categories of, or these 4 different shomrim in these 2 different groups?
If I can jump in with a thought,
Sure.
is it possible to highlight different expectations of responsibility that by paying some amount of money, even a token sum, changes the relationship and what you like? You know, there's a difference. Like, I don't expect people to go to the ends of the earth for a favor the same way I might if I had an employee-employer or a contractor-hirer relationship.
Okay, so that definitely highlights the difference between a shomer chinam and a shomer sachar, and explains why they might, they would be in 2 different, very contrasting, as you say, groups, because once money is changing hands, once the owner of the item is paying somebody to watch over his property or her property, then there is a certain greater level of expectation in terms of the level of responsibility that guardian will then invest in this relationship, in this watching over the item. But why might the Mishnah have grouped the shoel, the borrower, together with the shomer chinam, right? The shomer chinam is doing basically a tremendous favor for the owner of the object, the owner of the item or animal, right? They're taking on responsibility for the item without being paid. The shomer chinam is getting, the shomer sachar, excuse me, is getting some sort of salary, but why put the borrower together with the shomer chinam and the renter or socher together with the shomer sachar? Now, I think something that you said just a moment ago does ring true, but it's a little bit, right? Let's think this through for just a moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my first thought is that a borrower does not imply payment, so that has the same kind of like, well, same that's the same similar type of relationship as it sets like borrowing also has a similar relationship to asking a favor, comparable to how a renter has a similar relationship to a contractor and employee in that, there's money and that changes the terms of the relationship on some fundamental level.
Okay, so you're right that basically it seems like by grouping the four shomrim into these two subgroups, again, shomer chinam and shoel versus shomer sachar and socher, the Mishnah seems to be highlighting the exchange of money, right? The money transferring hands as being the primary, the most distinctive feature. But it's worth noting, right, that in a sense, the shomer chinam is almost the polar opposite of the shoel, right? The shomer chinam, the one who is guarding this property for no fee, right? Just, as a favor out of the goodness of his or her heart, right? They are receiving essentially no benefit from this relationship, from this responsibility that they have assumed. Whereas the shoel, the borrower, is receiving absolute benefit, right? The shoel, the borrower, has paid nothing for this item that they have now gained use of, right? So again, no money has changed hands in either of those two cases, but in one case, the shomer is expending everything and receiving no benefit. In the other case, the shoel, the borrower, is expending no money and receiving all the benefit, right? If anything, it is the owner of the item who receives nothing, essentially, in the relationship with the shoel, right? Just doing it out of out of largesse, out of the goodness of his or her heart. Thinking about that other grouping, the shomer sachar and the socher, you're right that what seems to distinguish or to connect those two is the fact that in both of those relationships, money changes hands. But again, it's worth noting that the money is changing hands in opposite directions, right? The shomer sachar is being paid for their services, whereas the socher, the hirer, the renter, is paying the owner for the right to use their property, right? And so again, the shomer sachar is, again, receiving some benefit, but still doing a favor, whereas the socher is paying for the use of the animal, but nonetheless still receiving some benefit. In any event, the Mishnah goes on to say, and we're going to see again that is this background is relevant for understanding the Mishnah, the opening Mishnah of our chapter 8. So I want to just finish up with this Mishnah in chapter 7. The Mishnah here goes on to say, Shomer chinam nishba al hakol, v'hashoel mishalem et hakol. And here I think the Mishnah is underscoring what we just discussed. An unpaid bailee takes an oath over every outcome. That is, whether the item was lost or stolen or broken, or if the animal died, the shomer chinam, the unpaid bailee, must take an oath that it happened as he described. In other words, that he was not negligent. And then he is exempt from payment. On the flip side, the borrower, the shoel, does not take an oath, but he or she pays for every outcome, even in a circumstance beyond their control, right? Even if there was what we would call onus, right? Something happened, this animal just up and died, right? There was a hurricane and something, right? Something totally out of this person's control caused damage to the item that they borrowed. Nonetheless, they become responsible for everything, right? So again, what the Mishnah is underscoring here is that the shomer chinam bears the smallest, the least amount, virtually no responsibility for the item that was entrusted to them, whereas the borrower bears the maximum amount of responsibility in that respect. And again, it's a reflective of the amount of benefit that they are receiving from the item, as we discussed. And in that respect, these two are a pair because they're polar opposites. In contrast, the Mishnah goes on to say, "V'noseh sachar v'socher nishba'in al hashvura ve'al hashvuya ve'al hameta, u'mishalmin et ha'aveda ve'et ha'geneva." Right? So the rules with regards to a paid bailey, the shomer sachar, and a renter are one and the same, right? They are a pair because, in fact, the same laws pertain to them. They take an oath over an injured animal, over a captured animal, over a dead animal, and again, you could apply these respective categories in a way that makes sense to inanimate objects as well, attesting that the mishaps were caused by circumstances beyond their control, and then they're exempt, but under any circumstances, they have to pay for loss or theft, right? So in that respect, they are a pair as well. Okay, so that's the background. With having read those verses and having reviewed this Mishnah from chapter 7, I think we are just about ready to get to the first Mishnah of chapter 8. Just before we do so, I want to return for a moment to the verses that we saw in the Torah, and specifically again to the verses that pertain to the borrower and to the renter, these last two that I've placed in a box here. Because as I said a few minutes ago, the interpretation of these verses becomes the subject of our first Mishnah. So let's read them again very quickly. We have Ki yishal ish me'im re'ehu v'nishbar omet. Be'alav ein imo shalem yishalem. Im be'alav imo lo yishalem. Im sachirhu ba bischaro. Which again, JPS renders, when any party borrows an animal from another and it dies or is injured, its owner not being with it, restitution must be made. If its owner was with it, no restitution need be made. But if it was hired, that payment is due. Right now, what does that mean? That payment is due. What payment do you understand is due? Right, in the event that it was hired. From this translation, I would say it sounds like, right, at least in JPS's rendering of these verses, it sounds like the sachir, the hirer or renter, is being contrasted here with the borrower, the shoel. In the case of a borrower, when an onus occurs, when an unforeseen circumstance causes injury or even death to this animal, then whether or not the borrower needs to assume responsibility and pay for that dead animal is all contingent on whether the original, the actual owner of the animal or of the item was present at the time this onus or unforeseen instance occurred. However, it sounds like, again, according to JPS's translation, with a socher, does it matter whether the owner was or was not with it? Sounds, again, according to JPS, and JPS is translating this really tricky phrase, im sachirhu ba bischaro. JPS says if it was hired, that payment is due. It sounds to me like JPS is suggesting that by contrast, when an animal is hired or rented, the renter assumes responsibility for an onus, for an unforeseen circumstance that occurs, regardless of whether the owner was present or not. But that doesn't actually match, as we're going to see, that doesn't match what the rabbis understood the renter's level of responsibility to be. And here I just want to flip back for one moment to that Mishnah that we just saw from chapter 7. Right, in chapter 7, the Mishnah, and I'm looking now at the very end part of the Mishnah, the borrower does not take an oath, but pays for every outcome, even in a circumstance beyond his control. The paid Bailey, the shomer sachar, and the render, the socher, are the same. They take an oath over an injured animal or captured animal, dead animal. Those are all the onus situations, the situations that are beyond their control. And then after they take this shvu'ah, this oath, and attest that the mishaps were caused by circumstances beyond their control, they're exempt, right? And what do they need to pay for? For loss or theft. So there's something about those verses that, again, I think the JPS translation is trying to stick Hugh closely to the psukim, but I think what it ends up doing is highlighting the trickiness of this language, right? There's something about ima sachir hu ba bischaro that doesn't quite, the way the verses sound does not seem to match with the way the rabbis, at the very least, understood the level of responsibility that the socher, the hirer, the rentee, pays or assumes responsibility for. And now let's just take a look at, before we get to, just again, one more source that I want to see briefly before we get to our Mishnah. Let's look at for a moment at the way that Rashi explains this very verse. And here I want to focus in on the second paragraph here. If it be hired, right, that's as we just saw in the verse. That is, if the ox has not been borrowed but hired, then it came for its hire. And again, it came for its hire. This is obviously a different translation than JPS has of haba bischaro. JPS again said the payment is due, ba bischaro, but we just discussed what the problem with that translation is. And so this translation here renders ba bischaro is it came for its hire. And it says, well, that means that it came hasocher ba bischaro, it came into the hands of this hirer and not by way of loan. In other words, it's not, this hirer is not a borrower. He didn't acquire the object for free, but rather by virtue of having paid for the services. He does not get the entire benefit of the transaction like the shoel, like the borrower, since he is using it only because he has paid hire for it. And consequently, the owner benefits also because the owner is getting the rent money, right? And therefore, the law applicable to a borrower does not apply in the case of the socher, the hirer, that he should be held liable for loss by accident. Scripture, however, points out Rashi, does not state explicitly what his, that is the hirer's, law actually is, whether he has to be treated as the gratuitous Bailey, the shomer chinam, or as the Bailey for payment, the shomer sachar. And therefore, says Rashi, the sages in Israel differ in their opinion as to how the socher has to make restitution. Rabbi Meir says he is responsible only as a gratuitous Bailey, as a shomer chinam, while Rabbi Yehuda says even as a Bailey for payment, right? So that Rabbi Yehuda says he's much more akin to the shomer sachar. Now, it seems like the Mishnah that we saw again here in chapter 7 seems to be going according to which of those two Tanaim, right? Let's look back again. Is that Mishnah according to Rabbi Meir, that the socher is like a shomer chinam, or is that Mishnah more like Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the socher is like a shomer sachar? Well, I think we would have to say that this Mishnah in chapter 7 sounds like it reflects the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, right? It says pretty clearly that the shomer sachar, noseh sachar, and the socher are one and the same and bear the same level of responsibility. And that seems to be Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in a different Tanaitic source as quoted here by Rashi. Now, finally, let's take a look at our Mishnah in chapter 8. Our chapter, this opening Mishnah, begins Hashoel et hapara v'sha'al be'aleha ima o sachar be'aleha ima. Right. So here we have a case of someone who borrowed a cow, and again, a cow is the stand-in property, the stand-in object, it's an animal. So a person borrowed a cow, but didn't only borrow the cow itself, that person also borrowed the services of the cow's owner with it, or possibly that borrower took the cow and then hired the owner with it, right? So for example, he borrowed the cow, but he needs somebody to take care of the cow or to milk the cow on a daily basis. So he either asks the owner to do him a favor for free, if let's say it's a friend or a relative or a neighbor, or, right, in another circumstance, we have him actually paying the owner of the cow to milk the cow, right? So the point being that the owner comes along with the cow when it goes over, when it is transferred over to the responsibility of this borrower. That's one scenario that the Mishnah addresses. Another scenario that this Mishnah addresses is he borrowed the service of the owner or hired him, and only then afterwards borrowed the cow, right? So one case that we can imagine is where he borrowed the cow and together with the cow borrowed or paid for the services of the owner. Another case is he already had this owner doing him a favor or was already paying the owner for some services, and then by way of favor asked this guy who was already in his employ whether he could please lend him his cow, right? The point that our Mishnah here is making is that in all such cases, if the cow died, vameta, patur, the borrower is exempt from liability, right? Now, as we have said already a few times, normally a borrower is responsible for cases of ones, right? If a cow or anything, right, that the borrower takes into his or her responsibility dies, right, is somehow, rendered unusable by circumstances beyond their control, the borrower's actually responsibility, again, because the borrower is receiving tremendous benefit. But in this particular case, the Mishnah says the borrower is not responsible. Why? And here the Mishnah makes it very clear that it is, in fact, just interpreting or spelling out the halacha based on the verses that we read, right? Because the Torah itself in Sefer Shmot, in Shmot Kafbet, says, Im be'alav imo lo yishalem. If its owner is with him, he does not pay. Now, up until now, it sounds like the Mishnah is kind of telling us what we might have understood pretty straightforwardly from the verses itself. But now the Mishnah goes on to add, if one first borrowed the cow and only afterwards borrowed the services of the owner or hired him, and then the cow died, in that case, he is in fact liable to pay the owner for the cow. This is the halacha, even if the owner was working for the borrower at the time. Because this, according to the Mishnah, is the meaning of the continuation of the verse, Be'alav en imo shalem yishalem. Now you might be saying, wait a second, hold on a second. You just told me half a minute ago that in fact the owner was with the cow when the cow died. So how then does the Mishnah is clearly trying to interpret the continuation of that verse, Be'alav en imo shalem yishalem. What is the Mishnah suggesting that section of the verse actually means? All right, let's read that again. Aval sha'alet ha'para ve'achar kach sha'alet ha'be'alim o scharan v'meta chayav. Right, if one first borrowed the cow and only afterwards borrowed the services of the owner or hired him, and then the cow died, he is in fact liable to pay the owner for the cow, right? Shene'emar be'alav en imo shalem yeshalem. Right, so it sounds like the Mishnah here says, you know what? What the verses are teaching us is that what we have to focus on is not whether the owner was literally, physically present when this cow, up and died. What matters is the order of the transactions. If the owner came along with the cow from the very outset, right, was hired or had his services were borrowed at the same time that the cow was borrowed, or in fact, perhaps he was even working for or doing a favor for the shoel, the borrower, prior to the cows showing up. That's the case of that the Torah means. That's what the Torah means when the Torah says im be'alav imo, if the owner was with him. What the Torah means, according to the Mishnah, by be'alav enimo, the owner was not with him, is in fact, it really hinges on the order of the transactions. That's a case that what the Torah means there is that if the cow was borrowed first and only subsequently, perhaps at a later date, the services of the owner were either borrowed or rented, then it doesn't really matter if the owner was physically present when the item died, when the animal died. Nonetheless, right? That is a case. That's what the Torah means when it says be'alav enimo. Now, you might be saying to yourself, why is the Mishnah making this so complicated? It sounds pretty straightforward from the verses. And it seems to me, I think, that what the Mishnah is really picking up on here is the fact, again, let's go back to the verses for just a minute. The verses sound a little bit redundant, right? The verses here say, and again, I'm focusing on the ones in the box here, 13 and 14. The verses say, im be'alav ein imo shalem yeshalem. If the owner is not with the animal, then the borrower is liable and must pay. Okay, I can pretty straightforwardly understand, intuit myself, that if the Torah is telling me that you don't have to pay if the owner is present, okay, then it should be pretty obvious that the Torah means to teach me that if the owner is present, then I won't have to pay. So why did the Torah bother to state the obvious or the seemingly obvious in verse number 14? Right? We know the rabbis had a very pretty ironclad principle, pretty ironclad understanding that the Torah does not waste words. There's actually a bit of a Tanaitic dispute about this. Rabbi Yishmael says, Dibrat Torah kilashon bnei Adam. Sometimes the Torah does employ poetic language and therefore, add words for the sake of the poetics, you could say. But Rabbi Akiva, in his opinion, was the one that prevailed among the rabbis, says, no. The Torah is very sparing in its language. The Torah does not simply state the obvious. If it seems like the Torah is stating the obvious or simply repeating a word for some poetic purpose, then you have to think twice, right? It must be that the Torah is in fact trying to teach us something additional, right? The Torah does not waste words. If the Torah uses a seemingly redundant word, it must come to teach us something that would not be obvious without that repetition. And that's what our Mishnah seems to be. That's the principle that our Mishnah seems to be operating with. Our Mishnah seems to be saying, listen, it can't be that verse 14 is just stating what we would have already known from verse 13. And therefore, if verse 14, again, seems to state the obvious, be'alav imo lo yeshalem, right, that if the owner was with it, no restitution need be made, well, then it has to be that that verse is in fact trying to teach us a halacha, to provide us some insight into the law that we would not have known otherwise. And according to the Mishnah, that insight is that what matters here in terms of determining whether the borrower does or does not assume responsibility for the animal is the order in which the borrower took upon himself or asked for the services of the cow as opposed to the services of its owner, right? As long as the services of the owner were hired or were acquired, were asked for at the very same time that the cow was, then that's considered be'alav imo, and the borrower does not need to pay. Any other case, as if the order is opposite, then it certainly does count. Okay, I wanted to point out, as I said at the beginning of this class, chapter 8 seems a little bit diverse, let's say, in its topics. It is not, the mishnayot of this chapter are not as neatly tied to one another as the mishnayot of several other chapters that we have seen in this tractate. Bava Metzia chapter 8 begins in Mishnah 1 that we just saw with laws that pertain to borrowers. And again, as we just saw, it seems to really hone in on an explication of the related verses in Exodus 22. Mishnah 2 goes on, and we'll see Mishnah 2 in just a moment. Mishnah 2 goes on to deal with laws pertaining to borrowers and or renters, as does Mishnah 3. But from here, the Mishnah seems to digress a little bit. Mishnah 4 and Mishnah 5 are not really about borrowers and renters, so much as they are laws that pertain to buyers and sellers. Now, these laws follow on the heels of the ones that the Mishnah teaches about borrowers and renters, because in Mishnayot 4 and 5, what we see is that the principles that apply to borrowers and renters can sometimes be applied to other relationships, such as the relationship between a buyer and a seller of an item. From that discussion, which again already takes us a little bit further, away from the focus on the borrowers, the renters, the four shomrim in general. From here, the Mishnah moves on in 6, 7, and 8 to talk about what seems to be an entirely different topic, and that is laws that concern renting out property. Now, again, the laws of renting out property, which incidentally take us not only to the end of this chapter, but in a certain sense, as we'll see next week, really through to the end of the tractate. On the face of things, these laws do not seem to be related to laws pertaining to borrowers or to renters, really. Of course, the common thread here is that, as we have seen, the laws of borrowers are, for the rabbis and for the Torah itself, in relationship or related to the laws of borrowers. And once we talk about socher, the renter of a cow or the renter of some other object, animate or inanimate, then there is some connective tissue to these laws that pertain to renting out property, although that is, of course, right, we're not talking about movable goods there. We're talking about landed property or houses specifically. And so, again, the connection between all of these mishnayot in the chapter seems to be a little bit more, sort of stream of consciousness type of connection, or one digression leading to another digression type of connection, as opposed to in other chapters, the way that we have seen in other chapters, some sort of overarching, very organically and neatly tied together series of laws or topics. So this chapter again is a little bit distinct in the tractate. As I said, Mishnah Bet, as I pointed out here, Mishnah 2, that is still very clearly, as we'll see in a moment, about borrowers and renters. But I want to show you how that is really related, that is connected to, or that is the impetus for the Mishnah moving on to a different, although similar in principle, type of topic. So let's take a quick look at this Mishnah. Mishnah Bet teaches us, "Hasho'el et hapara, שאלה חצי היום ושכרה חצי היום, שאלה היום ושכרה למחר, שכר אחת ושאלה אחת ומתה. המשאיל אומר שאולה מתה, ביום שהייתה שאולה מתה, בשעה שהייתה שאולה מתה, והלה אומר איני יודע, חייב." Okay, I want to pause here and just explain this, right? There's a person who borrows a cow according to this opening scenario. The person borrowed it for half the day and rented it for the other half the day, right? So this is the person is borrowing the cow, but does so in a sort of a little bit more complex way than the straightforward borrowing that we saw in the previous Mishnah. In this case, right, he borrows the cow, but he borrows it for half the day and rents it for the other half the day, right? So I guess the owner is willing to, extend some generosity, right? But not willing to allow him to borrow the cow for half the day, but not for the full day. So he has to hire the cow. He has to pay for the cow's work for the second half of the day. Or, for example, he borrowed it for today and rented it for tomorrow. He rented one cow and borrowed another cow. Now, in these cases, the cow died, but it's not clear either when the cow died or which cow died, if we're talking about a rented one and a borrowed one, right? So in other words, it's not clear if the cow that died was the borrowed cow, or whether the cow that died in the period that it was in fact being borrowed and counted as a borrowed item, or whether the cow that died was either, in the last case, the rented cow, or the cow during a period in which it was rented, as per the first two cases. Now, that's the scenario that our Mishnah is dealing with. Now, the Mishnah is going to run through 4 different possibilities for dealing with this scenario, 4 different, part Bs of this situation, right? One possibility is that the lender says, right, the lender is the owner of the cow. The lender says the borrowed cow is the one that died, or it died on the day that it was being borrowed, or it died during the period during which it was being borrowed. Now, why would the lender, the owner of the cow, want to claim that the cow that died was the borrowed cow? Well, because as we've seen, when someone borrows a cow, he or she bears the ultimate responsibility, the highest level of responsibility, right? So if the cow was a borrowed cow, then the borrower is going to have to assume responsibility for its death, right? If it was a rented cow, as we saw, right, a renter is not liable for cases of onus, for cases of a cow upping and dying, unforeseen, out of its control. And so it's very clear that the owner has an incentive to claim that the cow that died was a borrowed one, right? So that's what the lender says. However, the shoel, the borrower, or renter maybe, depending on which time of day it happened, he says, you know what, I'm not sure. I'm a little confused now exactly when that cow, I don't remember precisely when the cow died. Maybe it was borrowed when it died, or maybe this was the borrowed one, but maybe not. In that case, the Mishnah says the borrower is liable to pay, right? Chayav. Okay, right? So here's a case, in a case of competing claim, in a case of, excuse me, the owner says definitely it was the borrowed one, and the borrower says, not sure. Borrower is liable. The Mishnah goes on to say, if the renter says the rented cow is the one that died, or it died on the day that it was being rented, or it died during the period in which it was being rented, right? So, and again, why would the borrower want to claim that this dead animal was rented when it died? Well, again, as we saw, a renter bears a much lower level of responsibility. A renter is not responsible for cases of death or onus. So that's clearly an advantage to the borrower, that claim. So in this second instance, that's the renter says there, or the borrower says very, very clearly, yes, 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 it was definitely rented when it died. And the owner of the cow says, I wasn't there. I don't know. I don't know what happened. Then what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says, in that case, when we have a borrower who says definitively it was the rented cow, and the owner says, I don't know, in that case, we're not going to hold the borrower responsible. The borrower is exempt, right? So we get the sense here that if we have 2 competing claims, one claim which is definitive and the other claim which is unclear, then we're going to stick with the definitive claim, right? We're going to assume that the person who has the definitive claim is the one who's going to rule the day. However, of course, there could be other circumstances. And the Mishnah here says, if the owner says with certitude, the borrowed cow is the one that died, And the renter says with certitude, the rented cow is the one that dies, right? So in other words, now here in this case, we have two definitive claims, competing definitive claims. Then what does the Mishnah say? The renter takes an oath that the rented cow is the one that died, and then he is exempt from liability. Now, you might be asking yourself, why does the renter take the oath? Why doesn't the owner take the oath? And why, if the renter is willing to take the oath, then we'll just, absolve him of responsibility. Why not do it the other way around? And the basic answer seems to be, as we know, the person who is in possession of an object is the one who has the upper hand in such transactions. The one who is trying to remove the object or get payment for an object which is not in his possession, that person bears the burden of responsibility, right? That person bears the burden of responsibility. Since this cow was with the renter at the time that it died, the owner is the one who's actually trying to get something, right? The owner is the one, he or she is the one who bears the burden of responsibility, and therefore we say, let the renter take the oath. If the renter is willing to take the oath, then we'll just absolve that person. We have one final case that the Mishnah presents to us here, which is if this one says, I do not know what happened, and that one says, I do not know what happened, right? So now here we have two unclear or uncertain claims. Then says the Mishnah, they divide the disputed amount, right? If nobody knows for sure what happened, then we just say yachloku. And this, by the way, goes back to a certain extent to the mishnayot of the first chapter. I just want to show you, and we're going to slowly move towards conclusion here. I just want to show you that this principle is the conduit for the Mishnah moving on, as we saw in Mishnayot 4 and 5 of this chapter, to talk about relationships between buyers and sellers. Let's take a look at what I mean here. Here you have Mishnah number 4. Here the Mishnah is talking about hamachlif para bechamor, right? Someone who exchanges, right? This is a form of purchasing, right? A form of acquiring a new item. You do it by exchange. You exchange a cow for a donkey. And as soon as one person does that, it makes that exchange, then the transaction is valid. And then afterwards, the cow is found to have calved. All of a sudden, the two people involved in the transaction realize, wait a second, that cow that was just exchanged, that cow, in fact, has a baby with it now, right? Obviously, another significant asset. So who does that baby belong to? Right? And similarly, says the Mishnah, we can think of a similar kind of situation with regards to one who sells his Canaanite maidservant, shivchato hamocher shivchato v'yalda. And all of a sudden, after he sells this woman, it suddenly is discovered that this slave woman has a child, right? Who does that child belong to? And I'm going to bracket the ethics and morality of talking this way about people, of selling people, of owning people. At another occasion, we can talk about the rabbinic ethics of that. But in any event, the question, I think, should be fairly clear. Who owns this baby? And the Mishnah here says, if the seller says, the birth occurred before I sold the cow or maidservant, so that the offspring belongs to me, and the buyer says, no, the birth occurred after I purchased the cow or the maidservant, and so the offspring belongs to me, right? So here is a case where there are two competing definitive claims, right? What did we say about that? Well, then they divide the value of the offspring between them. Now, by the way, this is a little different than the Mishnah that we just saw with regards to the borrower and the owner. Insofar as here, when they both make definitive claims to the item, they divide it, as opposed to in that Mishnah, it's when they both made unclear or uncertain claims, they would divide it. Otherwise, we said, hamotzi michavero alav haraya, the one who's actually holding the item has the upper hand. Here, it seems like, right, it's unclear, right, when this baby came in. And so we say yachloku. And again, this should remind you, it should hearken back in a way to the very opening Mishnah of the whole tractate, with the two people, Shnaim ochazin betalit, two people are holding onto the object at the same time, and the laws pertaining to Yachloku, the Yachloku principle there as well. Now, I didn't bring the translation of the rest of the Mishnah, but I want to note that the Mishnah here, again, talking about buyers and sellers, goes on to discuss a situation where there's an unclear claim on the part of one of the parties, or both of them make an unclear and undefinitive claim. And the Mishnah basically, again, going through these different scenarios, rules how to deal with these buyers and sellers who are contesting part of the property that was exchanged, part of this business transaction. And you can already see that this is in a way reminiscent, certainly, of Mishnah Bet that we saw just before, although Mishnah Bet was more on topic and pertained to the shoel and the socher and the owner of those objects. But that's how we get to this Mishnah 4 and to Mishnah 5, which is very similar as well. It has to do with olive trees that were sold and olives that they produced after they were sold, but similar idea, disputed claims between the two people transacting these things. And as I said, and I want to bring us towards conclusion here, excuse me, but as I said, the remainder of the chapter, the last 4 mishnayot of this chapter, have to do with someone who is maskir bayit l'chavero, someone who rents out property. So not one who rents something, but rather this is told from the perspective of the one who is doing the renting. But again, because we have renting relationship here, that is perhaps how it ties back to the topic, the original topic of our chapter. And just so that there are all different laws that appear in these mishnayot pertaining to one who rents out property. But just to give you a little bit of a taste, you can see here, this is Mishnah number 6. Right, this has to do with eviction notices. How much time does a renter need to give his tenant or her tenant before they can evict them or throw them out or break their contract over the house that has been rented out? And the Mishnah teaches that, in fact, it has to do with what season of the year it is. And we understand that in the winter months, he has to give the person minachag ad Pesach, from Sukkot to Pesach, in other words, basically 6 months notice. Whereas in the summer season, 30 yom, or 30 days or 1 month, is sufficient. And the idea seems to be that in the winter time, it's harder to move, right? The assumption is it's raining, right? They didn't have nice sort of airtight moving trucks to move in, or plastic wrap to throw over their things, right? Moving in the winter was really disadvantageous to the tenant. And so therefore the owner would have to really give them a long notice, basically let them stick out the season, and only move during the summer months. In the summertime, you do have to give somebody a little bit of notice, but not so much notice, right? And perhaps this also has to do with how quickly the tenant would be assumed to find a new place of residence, and that too was assumed to be in some way contingent on the season. In any event, that's just one example. The Mishnah goes through many other halachot pertaining to renters and rentees. But with that, we'll conclude our discussion of chapter 8, and we will pick up next week for our final class on chapters 9 and 10, the final mishnayot of Tractate Bava Metzia, which I hope you'll have a chance to learn on your own in this coming week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Furst. Thank you, everyone who is following along, possibly in a recording. If people have questions, how can they get in touch with you?
You are very welcome. You can certainly ask Drisha to forward you my email, and you're very welcome to reach out to me by email, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have on this chapter or in general on the tractate.
Thank you. Looking forward to the final session on the following week. Before we switch teachers for Bava Basra, we will have the pleasure of learning with Rav Nadi Helfkot, and you can find out more and sign up at drisha.org/classes. Modin Simcha, and take care.